Nazism. National Socialism. In modern society, it is one of the most hated ideologies that there is. Everyone calls their opponents Nazis, and tries to expose similarities between the two. Even people not that far off from being Nazis themselves often label their political opponents Nazis. Nazism is hated, and thankfully so. To many, it is a word synonymous with evil. It deserves its reputation. The one time it entered prominence, it caused the bloodiest war of all time, and atrocities which are viewed as almost unmatched in their immorality. Trying to make a nation great, it managed to practically destroy it, with millions of innocent and unnecessary deaths along the way. The story of Nazism is a story of great immorality, and even greater failure. But they successfully invaded half of Europe. To what end? Losing the war? Losing millions? Getting their nation bombed into oblivion and cut in half for a few decades? The original Nazism of old is dead, and thankfully so, but Nazism as an ideology is not dead. Nazis are still out there. I don't just mean right-wingers either. I mean self-proclaimed Nazis, and people who undoubtedly fit into that category. They mostly sieve in echo chambers on the internet, and do the odd terror attack in real life. I think it is important we all understand the complete and utter idiocy of the ideology that is Nazism. To define Nazism, it is a far-right ideology, with origins in the infamous Nazi Party. Its primary features include extreme authoritarianism of the totalitarian variety, extreme antisemitism, racism, fervent nationalism, dictatorial government, warlike foreign policy, and extreme violence, anti-communism, anti-liberalism, and cult of personality. Yes, I know, not the most pleasant list. It is exactly the recipe you would expect for an ideology viewed as the embodiment of evil. Here my goal is to explain the immorality and idiocy of Nazism. There are a million good ways to attack Nazism. It is an ideology that is highly immoral and downright stupid. Here, I am simply going to isolate some of the more particular ideological components of Nazism which I intend on disproving. With its key features disproved, the larger ideology can be revealed as the abomination that it is, one horrific amalgamation of terrible ideologies. To be more specific, the features of Nazism I am going after are the following: authoritarianism, nationalism, cult of personality, antisemitism, autocracy, and the obsession and love of war and violence. Let us begin. Authoritarianism. Totalitarianism may be an even more fitting label for Nazism. Extreme government control over the life of the individual. There is no freedom, only tyranny. Laws, social expectations, institutions, and organizations should push individuals in the right direction morally. The people should be given the tools, education, and incentives they need to act morally. They should also be as free as possible. So long as they are not causing harm, they should be free to make their own decisions, as a responsible and educated free people. They know what they want far better than the state ever will, and will be happiest if they can pursue what they enjoy in life to its fullest. They should freely choose many aspects of their lifestyle to be their happiest, truest selves. This freedom encompasses everything from the right to use recreational drugs, to the right to be gay or polyamorous. Freedom of religion is also worth mentioning here. These are freedoms the individual should be endowed with to live their best life as themselves. They know what they want and should be free to pursue it whenever possible. We also have liberties of a more political variety. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to protest. These freedoms are essential so that a range of views can be heard out and power criticized. Power must be held to account and freely criticized. This will encourage good behavior, discourage bad behavior. They will make sure people understand things as they really are, or as close to that as possible. To confiscate these rights is an overreach of the power citizens should entrust their government with. Nazism is a totalitarian ideology. It hates all of the freedom and liberty I just mentioned. This is because the Nazi government hates the people that it governs. It thinks it can decide what is best for them better than they can. It views itself as a kind of very abusive parent, taking care of a child that it despises. The Nazi government is too afraid of the people to give them freedom of speech. It is far too terrified of and self-aware of its many flaws and weaknesses to give the press the right to criticize it. It is too afraid of its own fragility to allow for a protest. And it regards the people as too unintelligent to make their own decisions in life. A government which views the people with nothing but fear and disdain should never be given the power to rule them. Fear and disdain will always lead to nothing but oppression and cruelty towards the very people the government was intended to represent. Such a government views the people as fools, to be led, and when it is not viewing them with hatred, it is viewing them with fear. This is not the kind of government I want, and any rational actor will be inclined to agree. Authoritarianism betrays Nazism's insecurity and fear of the people, as well as its hatred of them. Authoritarianism is inherent to the ideology, and this flaw alone should be enough to dismiss it. There are, however, so many other flaws. Next, we have nationalism. Perhaps jingoism is a more fitting word here. An essential component of Nazism is extreme nationalism. Generally speaking, this is the idea that the interests of the in-group, that in-group being the nation, ought to be pursued to the detriment of the interests of the out-group. Do note that in some cases the well-being of the in-group may be sacrificed to some extent to make the out-group suffer a little more. Nazi nationalism is extreme, and far more about hating the out-group than loving the in-group. In practice, Nazi nationalism looks like an aggressive foreign policy, imperialism, oppression, exploitation, and dehumanization. Genocide also seems to be quite common. This nationalism typically justifies itself with highly ideological historical narratives, which typically act as a justification of its actions. At the core of this nationalism is the idea that we should pursue our interests to the detriment of the outgroup, who deserve no moral consideration. The only moral justification an action needs is to benefit the in-group. Some Nazis also hold the view that this violent in-group out-group competition is an inevitable political reality. This nationalism is immoral and incoherent. The line for acceptable selfishness is arbitrarily drawn at one in-group, the nation. This is completely arbitrary and inconsistent. The nation blindly pursuing its interest to the detriment of the outgroup is apparently fine. The individual pursuing his interests to the detriment of the rest of the society is arbitrarily declared unacceptable and morally wrong. This is a fundamental inconsistency. A consistent person should always reject or embrace the idea that any action is moral, just as long as it benefits they who took that action. The nationalist logic leads far more consistently to the attitude of an organized criminal or a cutthroat capitalist. This logic makes literally no sense. They say competition between nations makes nationalism inevitable and good. Competition also exists between individuals, and they do not think this justifies any immorality between these individuals. Nationalist embrace of selfishness is arbitrary, and it is inconsistent. These people are fools, wandering dazed at the crossroads between the logical, consistent positions of complete rejection or complete embrace of the selfish idea. The idea that any immorality is justified so long as it is in your interest is a foolish idea to be promoting. When followed to a logical conclusion, it will not lead to what the nationalist envisions. This is as they have drawn the line for acceptable selfishness completely arbitrarily, where it suits their ideological narrative. We also have the fact that nationalist logic here literally justifies the nationalists' own enslavement. This is not good moral reasoning. This is some serious bootlicker logic. If someone can benefit off of oppressing or exploiting them, according to the nationalist, this is morally justified. Spoiler alert, people can benefit off of oppressing and exploiting you. The nationalist morally justifies their own enslavement. They justify their own oppression and exploitation. They justify the oppression and exploitation of everyone they know and care about, out of desperation to justify their hatred of the outgroup. Nationalism is, as you can see, a complete joke. Our societies rely on reciprocal morality, people treating others as they want to be treated. This moral transaction is participated in by just about everyone. This is the golden rule, the most adored Christian principle, which appears in various secular and religious forms all over the world. This idea is the desired moral system, as all act morally and are given moral treatment in return. It is in your interest to act morally. A logical person will act nice, not simply out of compassion, but because they know it is in their interest. You can be selfish, but so long as you are logical, you know it is in your interest to act morally. Those who shun this idea are not just selfish, but are also idiots, who undermine their own moral treatment. Nationalism flies in the face of this idea. Unlike cutthroat capitalism or the mindset of the organized criminal, however, it does so completely incoherently and inconsistently. Reciprocal morality means brutally pursuing your interests to the detriment of others, is immoral and idiotic. It undermines your own moral treatment. Nazi nationalism, however, often accepts reciprocal morality, but only within the nation, which is also completely incoherent. Nazi nationalism, however, is unique, as it is not just immoral and idiotic, it is completely incoherent and inconsistent, as it draws the line for acceptable selfishness so arbitrarily at the nation. Here we arrive at another idiocy of nationalism which is worthy of discussion. Nationalists are tribalists, but they chose their tribe in a very odd way. People can be divided and cut into 1 million different interest groups. Each individual belongs to many larger groups with their own group interest. People are divided into interest groups along lines including race, ethnicity, religion, ideology, class, geographical location, sex, gender, sexual orientation, and country, to name a few. The Nazi normally chooses ethnicity, or as they may say, ethno-linguistic group, as their favourite in-group they develop their baseless obsession over. This is very odd behaviour. They also typically take sides on the other in-groups, but this is their primary obsession, and it is what their whole tribalist ideology hinges off of. Other divisions come secondary to their obsession with the ethno-linguistic group. Why they chose this group, we rarely do have to wonder. They may argue it is the most important. What in-group is the most important will vary greatly with the context. Sometimes ideology, religion, or class will be vastly more important than ethnicity will be. Nazis are also not very interested in what is undeniably the ultimate in-group, the country and its citizenry. Nazis do not obsess over the country and its inhabitants as the ideal in-group. If they did, they would be civic nationalists, not Nazis. If they did, they would have to accept all the minority citizens they despise are part of their in-group. The country and its citizens is the ultimate in-group. It is organized in a way no other in-group is. It has its own military, government, borders, laws. It is officially recognized and highly organized, making it far more significant than any other in-group is. This is more influence over reality than any of the other far less significant and more social in-groups have. If we want to talk about ultimate in-groups, the country and its citizenry fits that standard far better than ethnicity does. Therefore, you should be a civic nationalist, not a Nazi, if you declare loyalty to the ultimate in-group that you belong to. The obsession with ethnicity is bizarre, particularly given the understanding the Nazi has of what the in-group is and its historical significance. This understanding is typically romanticized to the point of it being a delusional narrative with almost no bearing on reality. The nationalist will often claim nationalism should be accepted as it is inevitable. This is also a bad argument. Firstly, violent crime is inevitable, and we don't simply embrace it, and nor should we. Inevitability does not justify embrace, when embrace will lead to more of the bad thing. Secondly, this argument is fundamentally a massive cop-out. Failing on the moral argument and cornered, the Nazi will claim their ideas are inevitable. This has no bearing on reality. It is also fundamentally an argument of the weak and servile. We should just give up, and give in to our primitive tribalistic desires even if it is bad. No thanks. Good things are worth fighting for, and bad things are worth fighting against, even if it is hard. I have no delusions. The fight against nationalism and tribalism in general can be hard. The fight for internationalism even harder. The fight is, however, more than worth it, and any rational moral person will understand this. A small degree of tribalism is inevitable, but this does not make it worthy of embrace, just as the inevitability of violent crime and greed does not make these things worthy of embrace. Nazi nationalism is not inevitable, and those who act as if it is seek to set in motion circular logic, which justifies Nazism as inevitable. Perhaps the greatest irony is that war, the child of nationalism, has proven internationalism is possible, and nationalism not inevitable, in the way the Nazi insists. War has proved the masses can devote themselves to a difficult long-term goal. They endure rations, curfews, husbands, sons and fathers dying in war, bombings and more to pursue a long-term goal. They suffer and often risk death for a long-term goal they have often been convinced is morally desirable. War proves internationalism is possible and nationalism not inevitable. People can be deeply ideological actors who will work hard and suffer for that which they have been convinced is morally desirable. The nationalists claim that the people's immediate greed and search for material comfort guarantees nationalism is a joke, and is disproven by wars, often started by nationalism itself. These wars prove the simple fact that people will suffer and work for that which they consider moral. The fervent nationalism inherent to Nazism is immoral, irrational, incoherent, and idiotic at just about every level. It has resulted in millions and millions of deaths and massive suffering. Its track record says plenty, but its ideological incoherence and irrationality is the nail in the coffin of both this integral feature of Nazism and Nazism itself. The only thing that is perhaps more damning than all of this is perhaps the fact that Nazism is so nationalistic and warlike that the one time it reached power, it managed to kill millions of its own in-group, start and lose the biggest war in history, and cut its own country into a number of pieces for decades. Theoretically, it is incoherent, immoral, irrational, and idiotic. In practice, it is the same and also a massive failure. Here we come to our next aspect of Nazism. Cult of personality. Cult of personality is integral to Nazism. Historically, Nazism birthed one of the most memorable and terrifying cults of personality of all time. This is interesting as Nazism loves nationalist rhetoric, but in practice, loyalty to the leader comes before loyalty to the nation. Let us take a look at history. Under the Weimar Republic, the military oath was an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and its institutions. In Nazi Germany, military personnel ended up swearing an oath directly to Adolf Hitler. Under Nazism, the nation was secondary to the leader. It will be argued that Hitler merely represented the nation and its people. Hitler's massive use of propaganda proves that, as is often the case with dictatorial systems, the leader does not simply represent the people. He makes sure that the people represent him. Complete loyalty to an individual is perhaps the furthest thing from rationality conceivable. And irrationality, particularly such political irrationality, is incredibly dangerous. Cult of personality is a tool of leaders who want blind followers. Followers who cannot see or acknowledge the many flaws they know they possess. A good leader will encourage rationality and criticism, knowing such criticism is essential for a healthy society. They will not manufacture a misleading narrative and seek to propagate conditions which lead to blind admiration, rather than rationality and healthy criticism. Cult of personality is encouraged, manufactured, and revelled in by exactly the kind of people who should never have power. Cult of personality is emotional. It is not rational or moral. It is an appeal to emotion. The reason this is an issue is because emotion having great political power is always very dangerous. Political decisions are incredibly important with far-reaching consequences, and it is essential that they are made out of rationality and morality, not emotional attachment to a manufactured and false representation of a leader. Cult of personality is a political illness. It is unhealthy to the political affairs of any government, and is deeply authoritarian, as it sees great power invested in one individual. Cult of personality is an enemy of rationality. It is a morally repulsive idea, which is the enemy of a rational, healthy society. Now we have one of Nazism's most famous components to look at. Antisemitism. Extreme antisemitism. Nazi antisemitism is born out of conspiracism of the most deranged variety. The Holocaust reminds us that even the most idiotic conspiracy theories can have terrible consequences and should for that reason be viewed as serious threats, regardless of how absurd they often seem. The Jewish question conspiracy theory is absurd. It is a grand narrative which treats Jews, a diverse people, as a single entity with a single intent. It uses imagined intent and a selection of half-truths and outright lies, which form a larger narrative. The narrative is of course that Jews control the world and are evil and trying to destroy you and whatever you value. This is ridiculous and obviously untrue fear-mongering. Evidence of this conspiracy does not exist. It is nothing but a lie and a scapegoat designed to bring the Nazis power in a time period where people were hurting economically and susceptible to such deranged lies. It is absurd, conspiratorial, and irrational. It is an obviously untrue and absurd narrative which has been manufactured out of thin air. It has been manufactured as a scapegoat and a legitimization of Nazi authority, which is seen as necessary and justified in the face of the evil which was manufactured by the party itself to justify it having power. It is a fantasy, a delusional and absurd narrative, manufactured to serve the needs of those who seek to justify their power. There is no evidence of the conspiracy. It was kept afloat through wave after wave of propaganda, and it conveniently served as a justification and legitimization of Nazi authority. In other words, it was a narrative conjured up by the delusional and power-hungry, with the goal of legitimizing their authority, and it did just that. Nazi anti-Semitism is dangerous, but it should be understood as more than the mere hatred and immorality which it most certainly is. It should be viewed as a lie, a delusional and dishonest narrative manufactured to serve a political purpose. The politically charged conspiracy is dangerous, immoral, and stupid. The idea that Jews, a highly diverse number of individuals who share one common characteristic, are working together as part of a grand conspiracy has never been proven and never will be. It is nothing but a conspiracy designed and manufactured to legitimize Nazism as a necessary solution to this fictional threat. It makes no sense, but it doesn't have to. Ideologies such as Nazism do not teach people how to think, they teach them what to think. The complete lack of free speech and ideological diversity makes it perfectly evident Nazism does not intend on having a population that knows how to think, so much as it wants one that has been told and taught what to think. Nazism's anti-Semitism is nothing but an absurd, conspiratorial lie, clearly designed and manufactured to justify Nazi rule. It would be laughable had it not proven itself to be so dangerous. Moving on from the immorality and idiocy of anti-Semitism, we come to our next ideological component. Autocracy. Autocracy is of course a political system in which one party or individual has absolute power. It is the opposite of a democratic system. Power is held by one party rather than numerous different and opposing parties. Perhaps most importantly, the people do not rule through voting. It is not a system of government by the people, it is a system in which the people are governed by a party or leader who is not elected or challenged in any particularly meaningful way. Nazism is a textbook example of autocracy. Autocracy concerns the role of the people in the government that rules them. It is not to be confused with authoritarianism, although both autocracy and authoritarianism frequently appear side by side in dictatorial systems and ideologies, such as Nazism. Authoritarianism is about the influence of the government on the people. Autocracy is about the influence of the people on the government. So why is autocracy so bad? It is my belief that the people should rule themselves. The only moral government is government by the people. This can be direct democracy, representative democracy, or a bit of both. The people should have a say in the rules that govern their life. They should have a say in their own governing. To me, it is obvious that this is the only moral answer. It ensures their rulers represent them to the greatest possible degree. The people should rule themselves. They should not be ruled. The autocrat thinks exactly the opposite. The autocrat regards the people as a foolish mass to be led. The autocrat either views them as too stupid to govern themselves, or fears them as intelligent enough to observe his many flaws and remove him for that reason. In other words, the autocrat views the people with disdain and/or fears that they may be smart enough to recognize his flaws and remove him from the power which he is so obsessed with maintaining. Someone who regards the people as stupid, as most autocrats undeniably do, should not rule those people. This is evidently a recipe for disaster. The autocrat views the people as lesser than himself. He is smart enough to rule, and they simply are not. Someone who considers themselves superior to the people they are governing should not be governing. Would you like to be ruled by someone who considers themselves better than you and views you as nothing but a fool to be led? A rational person would never desire such a thing. The Nazi is of course not a rational person. The Nazi is a bootlicker who will happily serve as cannon fodder for an autocratic leader who regards him as too stupid to rule himself. Most autocrats fit into this category. Thinking the people are too stupid to rule themselves is almost necessary to being an autocrat. Being an autocrat is in many ways a confession of this very idea. Acting as an autocrat is a confession of disdain for the people and their intelligence. Of course, then, there is also the autocrats who fear the people, who fear their decisions and the consequence this could have on their power if the system was democratic. This autocrat is evidently deeply insecure. They know they are flawed, or follow a flawed ideology, and are highly likely to be removed by the people. This political insecurity is worrying, but more worrying is their interest in maintaining power against the democratic will, in spite of the flaws they are well aware of. Rational people should not desire a leader who is so concerned about their flaws and so obsessed with maintaining power in spite of them that they try to remove the systemic power of the people. This kind of leader is the epitome of undesirable. The supporter of autocracy will inevitably claim all governments need popular support to maintain power. The democratic leader does that by trying to convince the people they are the right person for the job and a good person to have in power. Power is in the hands of the people, and the leader or aspiring leader is largely at their mercy. In autocracy, the state uses violence, brute force, and propaganda to enforce power over the people, who are at its mercy. In democracy, propaganda does of course still exist, but the overt level of control over the people is nowhere near the level of the autocracy, and the people have a lot more control over government. To quote Winston Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So don't even try to compare the level of propaganda and indoctrination in democratic systems with that present in autocracies, where propaganda and extreme authoritarianism are always necessary for maintaining power. In democracy, people rule themselves to one degree or another, and in autocracy, they are simply ruled. In democracy, the people get a say in government, and in autocracy, they do not. In democracy, they elect their leaders, and in autocracy, they do not. Democracy far more effectively aligns the interests of leaders and the people. The people are far more eager to remove a bad leader or a leader they dislike through voting than through a bloody revolution against an autocracy and all the tools it has at its disposal. Autocracy supporters will sometimes act as if any government, without support from the people, will always fall. That government changes to represent the people far more easily when the change is done with a 5-minute vote rather than a potentially doomed and extremely violent conflict against the monopoly on violence that is the state. Autocracy is a system which regards the people as too stupid to rule themselves, and lives in fear of the decisions they may make if they did. It is a horrible form of government, and the only person who would support it is a bootlicker. Bootlickers such as Nazis who will gladly march to their deaths for the delusional and deranged ambitions of a leader who regards them as inferior and too stupid to rule themselves. To move on from the subject of autocracy, we come to our final major aspect of Nazism: the obsession with war and violence, the love of war and violence. Some may try to dismiss this as not being a key component of Nazism. I assure you it is very important to the horrific ideology we are discussing today. It is born out of fervent nationalism and other features of Nazism, which make the ideology inherently war-obsessed and inclined. Nazism started the biggest, bloodiest war of all time. It was eager to do so as well. Various military leaders wanted more time. They needed more weapons. The eager-for-war Nazis ended up starting the biggest war in history before they had such weapons. At the beginning of the war, Germany had a quantity of operational U-boats numbering in the higher 50s. German Admiral Karl Dönitz proclaimed he needed a fleet of about 300 U-boats to defeat Britain. In a sense, the Nazi obsession with war may well have been its own undoing, as it jumped into a war it was not ready for. Nazism is in many ways a primitive ideology. It worships power, it is built around tribalism in the form of nationalism, and it is obsessed with war and violence. This obsession with war and violence, paired with the hypernationalism, which can be viewed as a cause of this war obsession, gave Nazism the seeds to its own destruction. It is an unsustainable death cult. It attacked Russia and declared war on the USA. Moves like these sealed its fate. They were horrible strategic failures brought on by underlying tribalism and an obsession with war and violence. The deeply primitive core components of Nazism assure its own destruction. Over and over again it will destroy itself with its love of war and violence. It was nationalism and an obsession with war and violence which moved it from mere idiocy and immorality to being possibly the most destructive ideology of all time. It is a death cult, and it is made one by its primitive obsession with war and violence combined with underlying primitive tribalism. Such an aggressively nationalistic and power-obsessed ideology is doomed to rapidly expanding until it destroys itself. This is the logical conclusion of its extreme nationalism and a reliance on extreme nationalist rhetoric and sentiments. The historical record makes this very clear, as does the components of the ideology itself. It is a death cult doomed to expand before burning out and destroying the nation itself. You think this would stop if Nazism won? At its core, Nazism relies on legitimizing and justifying its power in opposition to an outgroup, be it the Jews, degenerates, leftists, or some other nation. Fearmongering and scapegoating are its favorite tools. When it needs to, it conjures enemies up out of thin air, as can be seen with the Jewish question. If Nazism was successful, it would simply come up with new opponents in order to legitimize its own power. It is unstable, unsustainable, and self-destructive. This is the ideology's logical conclusion. It has a short but very bloody lifespan. In this lifespan, it will kill many innocents, it will lead hordes of its idiotic bootlicker followers like lambs to the slaughter, as they die in masses fighting for the delusions of an autocrat who regards them as too unintelligent to rule themselves, as we have already been over. Nazism's obsession with violence means it is predisposed to destroying itself, but in the most bloody and destructive way imaginable. Nazism is immoral, but not just immoral. It is also a complete joke of an ideology. It is incoherent and irrational. It is idiotic to its core. Nazism is an ideology led by immoral and power-hungry men pursuing delusional ambitions. These men are brought to prominence by a dose of charisma and political intelligence. Nazism is, however, given most of its power by its less memorable followers, the delusional and immoral people who are thoroughly convinced they are brave fighters for their nation, when they are nothing but bootlicking cannon fodder of the most pathetic variety. Cannon fodder for an ambitious autocrat who considers his ambitions more valuable than all of their lives put together. It is an ideology of pathetic, servile bootlickers, the kind of people who will fight a war to be enslaved by a man of their own nation rather than a man of another. Fighting the oppressor themselves is never so much as a thought in the mind of their deeply servile brains. They will happily die in droves for the delusional ambitions of an autocrat who barely even views them as humans. In his eyes, they are expendable masses to be flung at the enemy for his own sake and the sake of his delusional ambitions. If they think they will lead themselves, chances are they are delusional. If their goal is simply to follow, their goal is to be cannon fodder. Cannon fodder for a cruel autocrat who values their life little more than the lives of the enemy. Their lives are valued only insofar as they serve the ambition of the autocrat, and only insofar as they can be sacrificed en masse to serve that ambition. These people are the ultimate bootlickers, and they are the vast majority of Nazis. Most of the Nazis of past were these people, and most of the Nazis of today will become them, if ever their system is implemented. Moral, intelligent, strong people have no business being anything but aggressively anti-Nazi, as Nazism is the epitome of immorality and idiocy. It is the epitome of all the weakest and most primitive and destructive tendencies of humanity. An extremely violent and destructive tribalistic ideology which is obsessed with power and seeks to achieve that power through propagating lies, fear, and division. Nazis can stop being Nazis, but as long as they are Nazis, they are the enemy of all that is good. Their ideology is immoral, stupid, and destructive. It promises nothing but death and destruction for both its enemies and its followers. We need only look at the features of this ideology and its historical record to know that this is a fact. Nazism is an ideological disease of the most dangerous variety, and humanity must rid itself of it, for good. Ideally, a disease can be cured, and people can recover. They often do. But if history has taught us one thing, it is that sometimes other means are necessary, when all other options are exhausted. Nazism has many flawed ideological components. Here I have targeted some of those key foundational components to reveal the immorality and idiocy of the larger ideology. From nationalism to authoritarianism, Nazism is rife with components that make for easy targets. Nazism's key components are as incoherent and irrational as they are immoral, and reveal the idiocy of the large ideology that they are essential to. If you take one thing away from my words here, let it be that Nazism is immoral and dangerous. But not only immoral and dangerous, chances are you already knew that. It is a stupid and pathetic joke of an ideology. Nazism should not simply be viewed as evil. It should be viewed as the incoherent, irrational, and stupid ideology that it is. This is the reputation that it deserves, and this is the reputation it shall have in the mind of every rational, moral person who walks this earth.